Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be bringing you a review of Wintersong by Jae-Jones. I received this novel as a digital ARC from the publisher via NetGalley for the purposes of review, but this does not color my review in any way. I'll admit it in that I went into this book with kind of little to no expectations. But when I say that, I don't necessarily mean that I thought it was going to be bad. More like I didn't need that much for me to probably like it. This book was pitched as being good for fans of the cult film Labyrinth, which starred the late David Bowie as a goblin king named Jareth, and I've heard from a lot of people from that time period that he was kind of like the sexual awakening for a lot of people who saw that film. And I suppose I can understand why. The character of Jareth from Labyrinth is really the only reason to watch the film, in my humble opinion, because David Bowie is so charismatic and enigmatic on screen as that character. So when you give me a book that has a goblin king and you're telling me it's good for fans of Labyrinth, literally all you need to do is essentially give me a sexy goblin king upon whom I can project the image of the late David Bowie as Jareth, and I'm probably gonna like your book. There's not much else you're gonna have to really do. And again, that's really shallow, but those were the only expectations I had when going into this book. I wasn't looking for much, I was gonna be easy to please. But I think as a result, I ended up getting a lot more out of this book. Sure, when it starts, it's pretty much giving me just what I want. The Goblin King, or Der Erlkönig. Der Erlkönig is a German phrase. It means the elf king, I believe, or the fairies. He's a figure of German kind of fairy tale lore and mythology, and actually some of you might be familiar with the phrase Der Erlkönig if you perhaps know the very famous poem that was done by Goethe that was later turned into a fabulous piece of music by Schubert.
Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an, der König hat mir ein Leids getan.
It's probably important that I brought up classical music because music plays a really big role in this book. But right now we're talking about the Goblin King. Der Erlkönig, he's mysterious, he's alluring in the way that I think goblins and the fae appear in many tales that really are pulling from classic lore, and he's also incredibly dangerous. So as much as he is alluring, that allure is immediately set off by something that makes you go, but it's not quite right. It's not human, there's something wrong here. And look, I'm no expert in the field of fae and goblin lore, but what bits I saw in this novel, I immediately recognized and was like, that's pretty much what I think of when I'm thinking of the fae and of goblins and the like. But for me, what was even more exciting was recognizing a lot of surprising classical allusions that this book drew. Namely in that it evokes the myth of Hades and Persephone, and actually a little bit of Orpheus. Now, the Hades and Persephone storyline is one that appears in many a fictional work. Beauty and the Beast, The Phantom of the Opera, V for Vendetta, and these are just to name a few that are really well known. As popular as it is, and as frequently as I see it, it's one that I think is actually really hard to do well. You see, often I find that a creator who's trying to repurpose the Hades Persephone myth doesn't really know how to properly handle Persephone. Oftentimes these Persephone characters, I find they are far too mewling, they're too timid, they never really ascend to being the equal of their Hades. And that's super important. The beauty of the original myths, and I'm thinking as far back as Hesiod's Theogony, is that for all of its many issues involving the lack of consent, especially in things like the Theogony, which I believe is one of the earliest appearances of the Hades Persephone myth, Persephone eventually always ascends to the side of her husband, Hades, as his equal. She is the queen of the underworld, and the ancient Greeks feared Persephone just as much as they did Hades. She was not only queen of the underworld, but she's a goddess of the spring. She's actually the embodiment of both life and death, and her movement between the world of the living and the underworld controls that entire cycle of life and death. And again, oftentimes in modern interpretations of the story, they never really get the Persephone quite right. She's just never quite the equal of her Hades. But this is something that Wintersong actually plays with really well. I see this story, which is about a young girl, or really a young woman, who chooses to give herself up to the Goblin King, the one who is king of the underground, or really this version of an underworld, for the purposes of playing with the laws of spring and winter, the very thing that controls harvests that mean life or death for humanity. This book is no longer just a fluffy paranormal romance story of a sexy Goblin King and some female protagonist who I can pretty much easily forget, because let's be real, it's about the sexy Goblin King. Not that that would have been bad, that was actually what I kind of went into expecting, which again doesn't say much about me, even though I really don't like paranormal romance. I was in it for the Goblin King, okay? This is a story that is about growth, about power and sacrifice, about, sure, love and romance, but also about knowing one's own self. And I think if anybody's a fan of the Hades-Persephone myth, there's so many fun little things, especially if you are a fan of classical myth or of the Hades-Persephone myth and you know kind of little Easter eggs surrounding that myth, you will see them in this book, and it's sort of just like, yes, I did not anticipate this and it's glorious. I mentioned before, there's also a dash of Orpheus, which is another myth that plays with the underworld. And I think it's a little coincidence that this book actually directly references the myth of Orpheus. If you're unfamiliar with the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, it's a very famous myth. Orpheus was the son of the muse Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and Orpheus was a fantastic musician and singer. He fell in love with a young woman named Eurydice. On the day of their wedding, she steps on a poisonous snake and is killed, immediately taken to the underworld. And Orpheus is so distraught over this fact that he goes down to the underworld to get her, and he plays a song that is so beautiful that it moves Hades and Persephone to give her back. Except for they make the one caveat. Orpheus cannot look back at Eurydice until they are in the human world, or else he loses her forever. She just goes back to the underworld, and you don't get a second shot at this. Unfortunately, he does look back, she goes back to the underworld, he goes back to the human world, he's so distraught, he's eventually torn apart by Maenads because his song is like so sad they get pissed off and it doesn't end well for him, and it's a very sad story. But in that story, there are really three main players. There's Orpheus and there's Eurydice, but there's also the music. I didn't know that this book was going to be as much about music as it would be about the triumph of living and of knowing your own self. Really, I didn't even know it was going to be about those two other things. I thought it was going to be about a sexy Goblin King. Really, I got so much more out of this book than I ever expected. Honestly, I probably should have guessed, given the title of the novel is Wintersong, but I just thought it was a pretty title. I didn't make the connection in my head that music was going to play such a big part in this book. But S. Jae-Jones's prose is absolutely poetic. She writes very beautifully, and in it she manages to capture the ecstasy of music in its pages. Because this novel captures that equal parts kind of joy and pain. I often sometimes joke as this silent scream into the void that we offer up from the depths of our soul when we listen to a piece of music that really moves us and can often inspire us. Maybe this is just me, as someone who has loved music since essentially birth, and I've played an instrument or sang since I was at least 7 or 8, I've always been surrounded by music. For me, it's just very deep within the very marrow of my being, and so when I get this book that talks about a girl who's a very good player but an even better composer and really digs deep into the idea of the power of music and how when we are that inspired, how we can dare to bare our own souls to the world and create. And the book really captures that sort of like wild abandon and simultaneous like fragility and tenderness that comes from music. I was astonished by this. Maybe this is because I'm a musician. I can imagine that maybe if you're not a musician or if music just doesn't really do it for you, you're not gonna dig this part of the novel. And maybe it won't move you as much as it did move me, but that for me was some of the most beautiful parts, was the way music had been incorporated into the story, so much so that it became like this third character. As you can tell, I love this book, and when I didn't kind of realize just how much I love this book till I reached its final, like, 2 or 3 chapters, and they are hauntingly beautiful. It just like gripped my heart in its talons and just wrung every bit of pain and joy out of it so that I was feeling kind of everything all at once. Just totally sunk its claws like into my soul, and I'll admit, I was kind of holding back tears while I was finishing this book. I didn't think that this book would move me that much, but for some reason I was so emotionally invested in this book that at the end I was just like, I'm having all the feels right now. Something about the way that S. Jae-Jones just like wove together myth and music and magic and everything else this book had just like really struck some sort of chord in me, and I got so much more out of this book than I ever expected. And sure, I'm the first to admit that this book isn't perfect. There are plenty of issues, and I'm sure anybody would love to sit there and point them out, but I really love this book with all of its imperfections, because in a way that sort of made it ring more true. I don't know how many people have this book on their radar. I found it by accident. I really don't even know how I did. And I went in joking, thinking I was at least gonna have a fun, fluffy time, and came out like emotionally traumatized in a good way. But that's it for me today, you guys. So until next time, cheers.